What's up, everyone? Jester Bell is back with another comic book review, but today we're going to be looking at 10 different comics, because today we're looking at my top 10 favorite comics of all time. Now, there's two rules to this video. The first rule is the comic has to be a self-contained story. So it can be a one-shot or a graphic novel. It just has to be a story that you can read it all in one sitting. It can't be just a part of a greater story, as a lot of comics tend to be. The second rule is these are just my personal opinion on these comics. These are not the comics I think are objectively the greatest ever made. They're comics that I think are very good, but they have a personal effect on me. They're very personally important to me, and I'll explain why in this video. So let's get started without further ado. So the first comic on the list, number 10, sitting at the number 10 spot, is X-Men Dark Phoenix. Now, this story is, I think, better told in the animated show, but we're going back to the comic where it all started. Now, this is a story that is about power. It's about Jean Grey, who is one of the most major X-Men, who has been possessed for a while now by an extraterrestrial being called the Phoenix. And the Phoenix is just starting to experience sensations through being a part of Jean Grey, a human being who can actually experience those things. And what happens in the story is the Phoenix, this being of great power, draws the attention of the Hellfire Club, who want to have the Phoenix's power. And so they begin to manipulate Jean Grey and manipulate the Phoenix to come to their side. And through being manipulated by these very evil people, the Phoenix starts to experience the sensation of evil, and she starts to enjoy that sensation and be intrigued by it and want more of it. And as the story goes on, the Phoenix becomes more and more out of control, to the point where she becomes the most dangerous threat that the Marvel Universe has ever known. What I like about this story is that it's very believable in how it portrays just how powerful and how dangerous the Phoenix really is, especially when she gets out of control. And it doesn't do so in a way that just makes it unbelievable and forced, like, oh, you better, because sometimes comics have the tendency to overpower a character just to get people excited, but this is done in a very believable fashion. I love the sense of helplessness that the X-Men feel, and that really everyone in the Marvel Universe feels, because no one really knows what to do about this threat, or they at least don't know what to do about it in terms of getting Jean Grey back from the Phoenix. It's a very intense comic to read, but it's a very entertaining comic to read, with all the different characters moving around and all the intrigue of the Phoenix and why she feels these sensations and what kind of being she really is, and all the different characters who move around and their motivations of saving Jean Grey, of manipulating her to get to the Phoenix, of the people foolish enough to think that they should be able to control this being that is the Phoenix. And it's also very interesting to see Jean Grey as ultimately a hero at the very end, if you are familiar with the story, which might go a little different than the comic book version. But it's a very thoughtfully written comic. It's by Chris Claremont, and I just think that it's a very exciting read, and that it's one of the greatest comics ever written, and one of a great sci-fi story, I also believe. So definitely recommend that, and it's my favorite X-Men story, and that's why it's on this list. Now, the next story I'm going to talk about is Two-Face, Eye of the Beholder. I've reviewed this before on this channel. It's a character study about Two-Face, Harvey Dent, and I think it's one of the best versions of his origin that there is out there. It explores his psychology and why he has anger issues and why there's two sides to him. And thematically, the story really is about the idea of being two-faced, about everyone seeming good on the outside and being able to flip it on a dime, or in this case, a quarter, or in order to just get what they want. We explore that with the villain of the story, one of the villains of the story. We explore that with Harvey Dent's assistant who betrays him, and we just explore it with Harvey Dent himself. We even explore it with his abusive father, in how his father will abuse him one minute and act like he wants to be a good father to him the next. So it's a very great character study. It's very consistent with its themes, and I really like how it explores the idea of duality, which is what Two-Face is all about. And I think anyone should read this story in order to understand why he's the way he is. Because neither the cartoons nor the movies have really explored the history of why he has this angry, violent, opposite side of himself. But this story does it very well, and it does it in a very scary fashion. So the next story on the list is a Spider-Man story. It is Spider-Man the Night Gwen Stacy Died. And if you are in anywhere near familiar with comics, even if you don't read comics, you're familiar with this story. It's, I think, the most single influential comic of all time, in which Gwen Stacy, who was basically Spider-Man's Lois Lane at the time, just died in a very shocking fashion. But I think that this story holds up today as one of the, if not the definitive Spider-Man story. Spider-Man is all about a character who's on his own, and he constantly has to deal with issues that seem very real, even though it's told through the lens of a superhero story. And in this story, he has to deal with the idea that he can't always win, he can't always save everyone, he can't always save the people who are closest to him. And it's just it's a very heartbreaking story to read. The build-up of how Gwen is captured, and if you're familiar with the story, you know what's coming, and it still hits if you know what's coming. And I like the kind of ambiguity of, was there really any way for him to have stopped what happened? Because there's people are always going over how she died, and there's not really the moment where you go, oh, if that character just didn't do this, then that wouldn't have happened. It's always just that this just had no way to be stopped, and I think that was a very scary thing to bring up in superhero comics at the time, and that's why it really hit people even more than just having a major character be killed off, the most major character they could have killed off at the time. But to me, it's just the definitive Spider-Man story, and as a Spider-Man fan, I just go back to it as he is the superhero character who always has the burden on his back that he doesn't always win, and he's just very relatable in that way. And I just think that this might be the definitive Spider-Man story that illustrates that at a time when comic book characters weren't allowed to kill off major characters like that. Of course, his was the comic that did so, even if it wasn't for the reasons that, even if it didn't have the impact that writers were expecting it to have. It still happened, and it still had that going on for it. So the next issue on my list, it's just a single issue. It's Catwoman #0 from the 90s Jim Balent run. This is the origin of Catwoman. It's one of the tellings of it, and I just think that it's excellent in that it explores her independence, how she was always an independent character and an independent woman, and how that really ties her to the theme of being a cat. She's called Catwoman because of her aloof independent nature, not because it's just cool to have a cat gimmick and to make purring noises and so forth. I think that this comic should be the definitive Catwoman origins. It's unfortunate a lot of people go to the Frank Miller Year One origins, which don't add up with her theme of independence at all. I think that it's just a great self-contained story that explores her with a lot of familiar tropes, like going to an orphanage or a home for girls and delinquents and having to deal with a abusive headmaster. That's been done many times before, but I like how it's done when you're dealing with such an extreme personality as Catwoman's, and how she fights back against these people who try to hold her down, and how she's always a person who's able to survive and come out on top. And I would absolutely recommend it to anyone who doesn't think Catwoman's a very good character. So the next issue on my list is Huntress, Cry for Blood. Now, this might surprise people to be on this list. It's written by Greg Rucka, but it's actually one of the first comics I ever read, one of the first DC comics. And I just love Huntress's origins as this person who grew up in a mob family but didn't realize it, and then had to grow up with a lot of fear and a lot of anger after her family is killed, and who was raised to be an assassin. It's just a really fascinating story to me, and I like reading it in full as it explores her as being another character who's very independent, who doesn't want a lot of help. She's kind of a toxic person, but this story shows her as she starts to let people in and starts to explain her origins and starts to try to figure it out for herself and get herself some closure. Now, I don't think the ending of the story really lands. I think it was a lot of build up and a kind of a too quick of an ending, but the way the story is told is just really it really makes you empathize with what Helena is going through, even though she, again, ends up as kind of a toxic person herself, and really the emotions and the heartbreak she felt as her family was suddenly killed, even though they themselves were not good people, and how she comes to terms with the fact that this family she regrets the loss of so much were not good people. And it really shows the parallel between her growing up and losing her family very suddenly and Batman. and shows how they both relate as characters. So that's my number 6 on the list, and number 5 is Batman the Dark Prince Charming, surprisingly. Surprisingly, because this is a very new comic, and I don't usually expect to like new comics this much. I don't usually expect to put them on lists like this. But this one is is an independent comic done by a more of an outside person who doesn't really work that closely with DC Comics to my knowledge, and Enrico Marini. And the big twist of this comic is it's Batman set in Europe. So there's various twists on the characters. Most of the characters basically follow the status quo that you might know from the Batman the Animated Series, so they're very easy to follow, but there's also tweaks to each of them in this new European setting and the story that's being told, both to their personalities and to their designs. So I just love the atmosphere of this story that's kind of familiar and new at the same time, and it's what instantly drew me into the story. But I also like the story itself. It's something that's done a little differently. It's about Bruce Wayne being told that he has an illegitimate daughter, and he doesn't believe that it's her, but all of a sudden that it's his actual daughter, but he all of a sudden becomes very invested in rescuing her, and it's a mystery to be told about why he's so invested in this girl and why, if she's actually his daughter. And there's a big twist at the end that makes it all make sense, that's been built up very subtly in the personality of this girl and who she actually relates to. There's also a lot of humorous moments with Joker and Harley in this story, and yeah, absolutely read it if you are a Batman fan. It's one that you can't let that skate by. So on the next issue, another modern comic, surprisingly, it is Harleen at number 4. Now, Harleen is a comic that surprised me, and it's not a perfect comic. I need to throw that out there because I feel that people tend to overhype these comics when they get something they really, really want and ignore the flaws. But still, Harleen is a story that I was asking for so long, for people to actually see the character of Harley Quinn for what it used to be, for the character that had a bit more depth than they ever think it does now, for a character that's supposed to be tragic. This story did not invent the character. A lot of people think that she never had any depth before now, but she did. It goes back to the story of Batman Mad Love. It goes back to the animated series, and it says, okay, what was there with the character? And wasn't there something there in the first place that we need to really explore? Wasn't there different parallels we could make between the characters? Wasn't there different psychological issues she had that we should bring to the forefront? And it just is an entire comic that gives her the deep, complex narrative that she should have always had, and that I believe she did have, but that most writers don't capitalize on or continue to explore at all. They just make her into the wacky vibe and aesthetic that the movies think she's supposed to be, that unfortunately a lot of the mainstream public think she's supposed to be. I would recommend any person who doesn't believe that Harley Quinn is more than a stupid little meme internet joke, I would recommend they read this story. I would recommend any fan of the character already read this story, and I just think that we should continue going on this direction and seeing both sides of the character, seeing a more humorous side of the character, and also seeing the tragic part of the character, which I think is the entire point. I hope that this comic has good influence on the character in the future. So at number 3, we have Batman The Long Halloween. Expect a lot of Batman on this list because I'm a big Batman fan. Batman The Long Halloween is considered one of the greatest Batman stories of all time, if not one of the greatest comics of all time. And it's a bit of a longer graphic novel, and it's about the early days of Gotham and about Batman taking down the mob. It includes the origin of Harvey Dent, and it's about how the mob and the regular criminals of Gotham were ousted out and they were replaced by the supervillains of Gotham, the colorful supervillains that mirror Batman himself as their colorful hero. And I just loved reading this story as someone who just loves the Batman rogues and someone who loves the history of Batman, and seeing how it all came into play into the more fantastical universe we see today, rather than something that was more realistic in the past. And I like how there's with so much death in this story that goes on, how it really explained to me why Batman himself doesn't kill, even though that's something that people think is a lot silly. But his motivations for not killing really make a lot of sense if you understand where he's come from and what he feels for himself, how he doesn't want to get into the trap himself of killing and becoming like the other criminals and the other villains of Gotham. And it's a good mystery. The twist at the end, some people question whether that really works or not, but it really kept me engaged in figuring out who who was the holiday killer. This is all about the holiday killer who kills annually. Once a holiday, someone in the mob family dies, and that's why it's called the Long Halloween, because it all starts on Halloween. And it will show you many of the Batman villains. It will show you Joker, it will show you Scarecrow, it'll show you Two-Face, obviously. And I think that's what makes it a must-read for any Batman fan. It just really explains to you so much about what the Batman universe is and why we like the kind of the tragedy and the darkness of it, and we're really drawn into it. So number 2 is Batman the Killing Joke. Now, this is the story that people for years and years and years considered the best Joker story, probably the best Batman comic ever written. And recently it's become very controversial because people are looking back on it and saying that look at just how disturbing this story is. And especially I think that because of Bruce Timm's Batman Killing Joke animated adaptation, I think that turned a lot of people against the story, especially people who had just heard about the story but never really explored it, because that animated movie really butchered this story. But I look back at it, especially at the time looking at it as a fresh fan, and I just think that it's still a brilliant story. It is a disturbing story. There's a lot of it that is not enjoyable to read at all. And it is still objectively the most disturbing Joker story ever told, not because it does all it can to make him seem as edgy and violent as possible, but because it does legitimately vile things. It makes his character do legitimately vile things that make sense in terms of the themes and the overall story that is going to be presented here by the Joker. It's the story that explains his ideology and why he believes that nothing matters and that why we're all monsters on the inside. A theme which has been echoed a philosophy the Joker has, which has been echoed in a lot of material, such as Harleen in The Dark Knight. It explains why he and Batman are opposites, but the same. How he and Batman could basically be the same person if they had just gone through different circumstances, maybe made different choices. The Joker remains to be a humorous character, but you really can't laugh at anything he's doing because he's so violent. But what I love about this story is that it's the first story that showed me a human side to the Joker. And by a human side, I'm not meaning a sympathetic side, because people often associate those two things. Joker's just way too vile in this story to be a sympathetic character, but you go back through his potential history of how he got there, and it turns him into a very relatable character at the same time. A person you could believe existed in real life. A person that you could see maybe going through those circumstances leading up, understandably, to going crazy. And so it makes him an understandable and a human character, just not a sympathetic one. I think it makes the Joker even more scary to show that he is really not all that different from a regular person that could really exist. And it also was the first time we saw Batman really show empathy for the Joker and want to give him a second chance despite all the horrible things he does, and to show the Joker being affected by that. It showed different side to the Joker that I don't think we ever really explore. It showed him as a human character, and I think that not only makes him more scary, but it makes him more layered and interesting, and I wish that more writers would realize that, because I think most writers just want to do the Joker as violent and as dangerous as possible to get a reaction, a fear reaction out of the audience, and I don't think that is the most interesting version of the Joker you can do. So Batman the Killing Joke, I still think that it is the greatest Joker story ever told, and one of the greatest Batman comics ever told, even though so many people are dismissing it these days just because of how disturbing it is. So now we're up to my number 1 favorite comic of all time, and that comic is Batman Mad Love. That is the original origin of Harley Quinn, the one that Harleen is based off of, and it is considered the definitive Harley Quinn story to this day, and I can definitely see why. I don't think on a surface level people would accept it as anything more than just a silly spin-off comic of the animated series, because that's what it looks like from the aesthetic. But if you dig into it, it really has a lot of different facets to the characters. It has all the facets that Harleen built up. It just took and brought to the surface. It explores her as a rather interesting character, someone who's kind of out of touch with reality as it is, someone who you could argue had more agency in this situation, even as she was being manipulated by the Joker. And of course, it's an exploration of manipulation and abuse like I've never seen before. It really makes it easy to relate to the experience of being in love with a very horrible person but not being able to get out of it, and maybe not wanting to actually get out of it. It really shows how people in abusive relationships don't see their situation objectively, and how to the outside it might look completely obvious to a person that they should not be with this person, that they're in danger, but to the person who's in the relationship, they don't see that at all. And that's just done expertly, even if Paul Dini, who wrote the story, didn't intend to, by the fact that you have the most obviously toxic, dangerous person in the world, the Joker, as the love interest here, but that Harley cannot see that. The audience can see that, but Harley cannot see that, apparently. And so it's just the most effective cautionary tale I've ever seen about abusive relationships, because not only because of how it shows that, because of how it shows how Harley basically ditches her entire life and changes herself, changes her personality, changes how she looks, just to appease her love interest. And again, it shows how people in real life on an extreme level can do that, how they will do anything to change themselves and get approval from somebody else. And so that's what just makes it such a human story. And there's so much more to dig into it that I want to do in a longer review. So much complexity to it that I'm not even sure if Paul Dini himself intended. But at the same time, it's a very entertaining story. It's a very funny story. It's a tragic comedy. It's tragic to see how someone basically lost their sanity and destroyed themselves over this person, and how they continue to be destroying themselves by it because of their dependence on another person. But it's also very funny, because it's funny to see some of the regular tropes about falling in love and getting a new crush put in this very psychopathic relationship, to see Harley just be going crazy and acting like a sap, like she's found her Prince Charming, when it's this deranged serial killer. It's got so much dark humor that just instantly can flip over to the tragic elements of the story. It's just a masterpiece of a comic. It has all the elements I like to see in a story: the tragedy, the drama, the comedy, and it has complexity. And that's why it's my #1 favorite comic of all time. It just represents everything I like to see in a comic, and I hope that one day someone, maybe even me, because I want to be a director, will make a movie out of that comic. So thank you for watching. Those are my top 10 favorite comics of all time. Please check them out, and I'll see you next time with a new video. Thank you.